Hello and welcome to this training session. My name is Ashraf Ayad and I'll be working with you today with one of the production shaders called MIP Motion Blur. So let's get started. We have a simple scene here that's a plane dodging a rocket, and if we just take somewhere in the middle, just to show you, I'm having a motion blur. Actually, we don't need the deformation. We can just go with no deformation, nothing deforming in the scene. Shutter is open 0 and closed at 1, and I have Final Gather enabled just to give us a nicer look for the rendering. That's all. It has nothing to do with the motion blur itself. So let's render this scene and see how it looks. While you're seeing is rendering, I want you to notice here that the motion blur is being calculated at render time because the MIP motion blur will act a little bit different. That's why I paused the recording so you guys can see it now. Alright, so it's done. We almost 1 minute 03. So let's keep this image for future comparison, and let's go and work with our MIP motion blur. So we're just going to go to the hypershade, and I already enabled the production shader, so I should find it here in the output. I was tired of getting the error of not finding the XPM, so I just created a bunch of XPMs here, so that's why you see an icon for it. So I got my MIP motion blur. I was going to select the camera, and so here's the camera that I want to work with, and my utilities, I should have the MIP motion blur. I just dragged it in here, and now I want to connect the motion blur to the camera. It's a post-process or an output shader actually. Matter of fact, if you look in here, let me open the camera. There's a section for Mentor-A output shaders in here, but this is not what I want. I want the old legacy one, so I'm just going to connect it manually. So middle mouse, click and drop it on the perspective, and you gotta make sure that you have the left to show hidden and right show hidden as well. I'm gonna take the message out of the MIP motion blur, and I'm gonna go look for the mental images slot. So I have my MI Mentor-A controls, and I have the first one is the MI out shader. Once I did that, I hope you guys noticed there's a button that was just automatically enabled. So let's see if we can do this one more time. See, it's gone here. Let's do it again. And I want you to pay attention to this section and hear it out. Legacy output shaders. And you will see now the MIP motion blur has been added to it. It gave it a color, depth, and motion vectors. And this is what we want. If you have it off, you want to make sure that you have these three on: color, motion vectors, and depth as well. You need all three. So let's go and render our scene now, see how it will look like. Oh, I just realized I had my motion blur still enabled, so I'm just gonna stop my render, and I'm gonna go to my render settings and under the quality, and I want the motion blur still active, or this clicked on. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close the shutter. This way what I'm doing, I'm not rendering any motion blur. However, it's just that this node, MIP motion blur, need to understand that this is active. So I'm closing the shutter, therefore there will be no motion blur from the render. It's just going to come from the MIP motion blur. So we're going to see that right now. And I'll point out that the render did not give us any motion blur here. Not like the previous one, which was rendering a 3D at render time, doing the motion blur at render time. This time it will be a post-process. That motion blur will happen after the rendering is done. And here it is. So now you can see the difference. This was done in 43 seconds versus 1 minute. So you will get a big difference at render time. So now, why would we use the MIP motion blur? The MIP motion blur is a fake blur. It's not a real 100% accurate. However, it will work in your behalf when you want to have some speed render or some reducing of render time. So it will, some scenarios it will work, but some scenarios if you need that actual 100% real 3D, this might not be your solution. But for the fast rendering method, this will be very beneficial for you. So let's see what we can do to tweak it a little bit. So the shutter is closed. We have the 0 to 1, same thing that you have before. So if I'm increasing my shutter, then I will have more motion blur. As you'll see now, the motion blur has increased. Now for the shutter fall off, the less fall off you'll have, the more dramatic of that blur will be. So let's keep this image here for a sec and render this part. And here it is. So let's see if we can compare. See how it is between the two. So the fall off itself can be useful when you want to over bright the highlights in here. So you can see it here. These are all smeared up nicely. And actually what's happening with the motion blur, MIP motion blur, what it does, it's calculate the difference between this frame and this frame, and it give you the smear in between, the smear of the color, and this is why we get the motion blur. So let's render that whole image. So this is the image that we have, and I just want to point out the background because we're going to jump now to the blur environment. So if I enable this by now, let's keep the image, and let's say if I try to render anything here, and let's look, I want to point out something in the output shader. Here we go. Error. The blur background environment scanline rendering must be off. So when you want to enable the blur environment, you need to go back to your render settings and you want to make sure that you're not using scanline. So we're going to flip to ray trace. And let's render this image one more time. Again, I just want to point out that the motion blur is a post process, so it will happen after. But I want you to pay attention to the background here for a second because it's going to flip right now. Okay, so let's compare the two images. You can see the blur in here. If you look at this area in here, for example, there's a big difference. So the motion blur has been added to the background as well. We can even exaggerate the shutter open so we can have something very obvious. As you can see now, obviously this is way exaggerated, but you can tell now the motion blur has been added to the environment, very obvious in here. Also want to point out that there's actual movement of the camera. Therefore, the camera can see the background changing and it will give you that motion blur. So let me reduce the shutter back to 2 again. We can disable the motion blur now for the environment. We don't really need it. The calculation of the gamma, let's keep this image here for a second. Calculation of the gamma, this will be used if you are using a linear workflow for your gamma calculation. If you are using some sort of a gamma correction in your or in post, you can put this to 1 and actually you can render this image here, just a section for it to compare, and you'll notice the color value will change a little bit because of this gamma correction. However, if you are using also some sort of a gamma correction node like the Mia exposure nodes, you will want to have this also adjusted according to that, but for this section we're going to leave it to 2.2. So this is just for the gamma correction. So let me just render this image one more time. Alright, and keep this for feature comparison. And now we want to look at the pixel threshold. So the pixel threshold, it will tell Mentoray or the render node here how far from this pixel that is moving to the next location before I actually start calculating the MIP motion blur. In other words, if the point here or the TV in here moved 1 pixel, then yes, give it motion blur. So if I increase this to a high value, maybe even 100, and I will render this section in here, you'll notice now there's no motion blur on the rudders, and that's because the value of the movement from in this CV from one point to the other did not go over the 100 that we just specified in here. Therefore, it did not give it motion blur. So using this, you can control which parts of your object that is blurring or not if you're knowing how fast they're moving. If you want to have a motion blur all over, you can just give it a low value. It's going to calculate how far these objects are moving, and therefore you will get the motion blur. Background depth is calculation of how deep the objects are within the camera distance. So if you have a scene such as this, for example, and you have the cameras here and you have objects way in the back here, you want to make sure that distance is covered in the background depth. So objects will be seen within the motion blur. For the depth weighting, I need to get to a different frame, and I want to see where the two objects go behind each other. So for example, maybe something like this, where the rocket is behind the rudders of the plane. Let's render this image. And you will see here now the blur of the rudder is on top of the rocket. And I want you to see how this color, or actually how faded it is in here. Once I enable depth weighting and try to render again this area, and now when you see here, it's very, very darkened, because what happened is the blur, by doing the depth weighting, it sees that this object is closer to the camera than this object. Therefore, it will overpaint the blurriness in here, or the highlights of the blur. That's why you see it so dark. So this is one thing that you want to pay attention to, and the good way of using it would be if you have a camera that is looking at, for example, the camera is still and the plane is moving, and you want to emphasize on the movement of the plane or over a still background, and this where you can use depth weighting. So let's disable that. And if we look now at the bottom here, you have three values: the blur frame buffer, FB's frame buffer, depth frame buffer, and motion frame buffer. These three values will set the ID for the frame buffers in case if you want to take these buffers out independently, but that will require some custom shader. So let's leave this by default off. The last thing we have is the use coverage, and this, if you enable this on, it will tell the rendering is I want you to look at the coverage channel rather than the alpha channel to calculate the pixel information to give us the blur. Also, I want to point out, when you're doing this method of using the MIP motion blur, I would not recommend using, sorry, I'm going to go in here, do not enable depth channel, because it's going to mess up the whole render. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to render this separately in a different render layer. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this session, and I'm looking forward to talk to you more.